Welcome. Today we're cracking the code on computer contracts. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Legal documents, kind of dry, right? But trust me, these are more like the battle plans for massive tech projects, and getting them right is literally the difference between a huge success and a complete catastrophic failure.
So let's just jump right in with a big question. What actually happens when a multi-million-dollar tech project, something a company is banking its entire future on, just completely goes off the rails? The fallout, well, it can be absolutely staggering.
Take a look at this number, £250,000. That's the amount of damages a commodity broker claimed when the shiny new computer system they were sold completely failed to do its one job. A massive, painful financial hit. And it all stemmed from a bad recommendation and a really weak contract.
Or how about this one? 1.1 million rupees. That was the amount of public money that just vanished into thin air on a government project. The software they got was so full of bugs it was completely unusable. And the worst part? The contract was so badly written they couldn't claim a single rupee back.
Okay, so let's dive into our roadmap for today. We're going to start with why tech contracts are so incredibly important and kind of unique. Then we'll dissect the anatomy of a really solid contract. After that, we'll dig into those cautionary tales we just mentioned. We'll also cover some other key IT agreements you should know about. And finally, I'm going to give you a step-by-step framework for absolutely acing any case study on this topic.
So first up, why do tech contracts need all this special attention? Well, think about it. Unlike a contract for a physical thing like a building, we're often dealing with intangible property. You can't just go and kick the tires on a piece of software, right? This brings up all these complex issues around intellectual property and, just defining what finished actually looks like.
And honestly, the stakes could not be any higher. A mistake in choosing a system, especially when it's combined with a poorly written contract, can be absolutely devastating for a company. And we're not just talking about the money they lost on the project itself. We're talking about the potential damage to the entire business when a mission-critical system fails.
So, before anyone even thinks about signing on that dotted line, these are the questions you have to ask. They're non-negotiable. How are we protected if this thing fails? What's the long-term plan for maintenance and training our people? And hey, who's on the hook if it turns out this software is infringing on someone else's patent? Getting these answers up front is your first and best line of defense.
All right, now for the toolkit. A well-drafted contract is really built from a series of essential clauses. You can think of each one as a specific kind of shield, designed to protect both the client and the supplier from all the different ways a project can go wrong.
Here's the basic blueprint of what you'd find in a really solid contract. It covers the whole shebang, from the project scope and how you're going to pay, all the way to liability and what happens if you just need to call it quits. Now, all of these are important, for sure, but we're going to zoom in on 3 that are just absolutely critical to get right.
First up, the scope, or what's called the requirements specification. This is, and I'm not exaggerating, the most critical part of the entire document. It is where you define in almost painful detail exactly what the system has to do. If you don't have this, you have no objective way to measure if the project was a success. And as we're about to see, this was the fatal flaw in one of our case studies. Next up is the acceptance procedure. This is the official finish line. It defines exactly how you're going to test the system and what the criteria for success are. It needs to be crystal clear. Who's doing the testing? What specific results prove that the system actually works? And, crucially, what happens if the tests fail? A vague acceptance clause is basically just an invitation for endless arguments down the road.
And finally, we've got liability. This clause brings us right back to those big, scary numbers we saw at the beginning. It specifies who pays for what when things go wrong. Now, suppliers will always try to limit their liability, while clients, of course, want to make sure they can get compensated for any losses. It is a very high-stakes negotiation.
Okay, now for the really interesting part, seeing how these clauses actually play out in the real world. Let's dig into 2 cases where weak contracts led to total chaos, starting with the one that cost a consultant an absolute fortune.
So in the case of Brownton Limited, you have a commodity broker who hired a consultant. This consultant recommended a system that was, to put it mildly, a total lemon. It never worked right, was completely wrong for their business. It was so bad they had to scrap the entire thing. This led to that massive claim for damages we mentioned, which eventually settled for £300,000. Ouch.
And then you've got the Fagisoft case. Here, a government ministry needed a new management system. But get this, they provided no formal requirements, none. So the supplier, Fujisoft, basically had to guess what they needed and then wrote the contract themselves. So when the buggy, unusable software showed up, the ministry had zero recourse. The contract they'd signed didn't protect them in any way.
And looking at them side by side really illustrates how you can take different paths to the exact same disastrous outcome. For Brownton, the key failure was just bad advice, and they were able to claim a breach of contract. For the ministry, though, the failure was a total lack of defined requirements, which left them completely powerless. The lessons here are so clear. Consultants are liable for their advice, and the client absolutely, positively must define what they need.
Of course, it's not always about building brand new systems from scratch. The world of IT is filled with all sorts of different services, and each one needs its own specific type of contract. This could be anything from hiring a single programmer to outsourcing your entire IT department.
You know, a really common point of confusion is the difference between contract hire and consultancy. Contract hire is pretty simple. You're paying for manpower. You're paying for someone's time, usually at a daily or hourly rate. Consultancy is different. You're paying for expert advice and assessment. And as we saw with that Brownton case, that advice carries some serious liability.
Then you have outsourcing, which is also known as facilities management. Now, this is a huge commitment. It's where a company basically hands over an entire IT function to a third party. In this situation, the contract absolutely must include clauses for monitoring performance, what to do if the service is bad, and of course, critical disaster recovery plans.
And even something as common as web hosting has key contractual differences that you need to understand. With colocation, you own your server, and you're just renting rack space in their data center. You're responsible for it. With managed hosting, you're renting space on their server, and they are responsible for managing all the hardware and software. It's a really crucial distinction to make. Now, in any hosting or outsourcing contract, everything, and I mean everything, revolves around the service level agreement, or the SLA. This is where vague promises become hard, measurable metrics. We're talking about things like guaranteed server uptime, like 99.9%, specific server response times, and how quickly user support will get back to you. These numbers are what give the contract its teeth.
Okay, for all of you who are studying this for an exam, this next part is especially for you. We've looked at the theory, we've looked at the real-world disasters. Now let's build a super practical framework you can use to break down any case study and deliver a fantastic answer.
Here it is, your 4-step formula. First, just lay out the facts. Who, what, when, where. Simple. Second, you've got to spot the specific legal issues. Where did the contract fail? Was it a shoddy requirement spec, a weak liability clause, a bad acceptance test? Third, apply those contract principles we've been talking about to explain why that failure mattered so much. And finally, conclude on who is at fault and, this is the most important part, what specific clause could have prevented this entire mess from happening in the first place? You use this structure every single time, and you'll build your argument logically from the facts right through to the conclusion.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. Thinking back to that disastrous Fujisoft case, where 1.1 million rupees of public money just went up in smoke, I'm going to leave you with this question. If you were rewriting that contract from scratch, what is the single most important clause you would add to protect the ministry? Answering that, well, that's what this is all about. Thanks for tuning in.